In times of crisis, we are reminded of how fragile life can be and how deeply we need one another. Join us as we explore the teachings of Jesus, reflecting on love, forgiveness, and our call to care for the vulnerable. This sermon challenges us to live out our faith through actively striving to strengthen relationships, serving, healing, and supporting others, while remembering that we are never alone. God's grace is ever present, guiding us forward. In the movie Die Hard, a perennial Christmas movie, feel free to argue amongst yourselves about that, John McClane is running from the bad guys. I can't remember how on earth he lost his shoes, but things are going poorly, and he's reached a dead end at an elevator shaft. He uses his gun as an anchor for a rope attachment to try to climb down a few floors in what seems like a bottomless shaft. He makes it into an air duct just as the gun gives way and plummets to the bottom. He famously strikes his lighter in the cramped darkness and utters one of his more memorable lines concerning his invitation to this elegant Christmas party that's been invaded by terrorists. Come out to the coast, we'll get together, have a few laughs. He then remarks about knowing how a TV dinner feels. Well, I think the scene works because we can all relate to starting something that seems like a joyride, to have it spiral into something very difficult or perilous, and having that moment in the middle of it all to stop and ask ourselves, how did it all get here? I got some major stuff accomplished this week. Was feeling pretty good as we saw no effects of the hurricane, only to watch it crash into the Big Bend and destroy so much and so many people's lives, to continue on through Georgia and head toward the places where our family lives, where Pam and I grew up, the places we dated and started a family, the places where our ancestors are buried, and the places we turn to for rejuvenation and solitude. We watched it lay waste to so many people's lives. Slowly, we're hearing from family members and breathing sighs of relief. They may be trapped. They may have difficulty getting supplies, but they're alive. I found myself looking forward to opening up the text this week and sitting down to share a little bit and study with my friends for a little relief, with a little extra excitement to sort of escape and get away. Well, I open a commentary, and here's the opening paragraph. Beware this week. As soon as you read the word divorce aloud, a whole sermon will appear in people's heads. Some will hear early sermons that were launched at them or someone they loved when a divorce occurred. Pain will make it difficult to hear the words you actually speak. Others will conjure up their condemnation of others based on this single word. In both cases, those jumping to their own conclusions may miss what is said unless you open to them clearly the complexities of this challenge. Come out to the coast. We'll get together, have a few laughs. With an ominous warning like that, it made me wonder if I'd rather be John McClane barefoot in a room full of broken glass. I think of that term, behind the eight ball, which in billiards indicates being stuck or blocked or in a difficult spot. But you know, when I was growing up and on summer vacation one year at the campground in Myrtle Beach, I got to play a lot of pool in the arcade, and one guy changed my whole perspective when he showed me a 6-cushion bank shot. If you did some geometry, you could get where you needed to go on the table, one rail or cushion at a time, taking a different angle. So let's stop and take a look at this from all of the angles and see where it leads. Firstly, the ones questioning Jesus, the Pharisees, are not completely on the level here. They're trying to cast Jesus into just such a difficult situation, put him behind the eight ball. Verse 1 is left out of the reading, which I think is a mistake, because it tells us where he was, which is in the same region that brought John the Baptist to his death for speaking out against Herod, taking his brother's wife through divorce for his own. They are trying to use the government to trap him and kill him. Well, when Jesus meets with his disciples, he speaks of the very first human relationship. God's intent for humanity is living in relationship with God and with one another. That's how he created us. The intent is to bring joy and fulfillment. The commandments, or God's instructions, are there to guide us away from the things that cause relationships to break down or that cause sorrow or hurt on anyone's part. We see in Jesus' example that he set, by the way he lived, a focus on others, an outwardness. Jesus said, "Deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me." That means that we too turn outwards away from our own self-centeredness to care for others and to live into relationships, mercy, love, forgiveness, and the willingness to sacrifice our own desires. That doesn't mean sacrificing the self simply to enable the selfish desires, sins, or selfishness of others, which only leads to compounding hurt and not what God wills for us. The passage has far too long been used to enable abuse and encourage the vulnerable to remain in dangerous, demeaning, or hurtful relationships with those who are only inwardly focused. It is not self-centered or inward to need help or to need to rely on others. But when we lose sight of the needs of others, we depart from our calling to follow. All along the way, we'll make missteps, we'll mess up, we'll hurt others, and we will fall short of being a faithful covenant partner with God and with one another. We are told that we all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. However, God is a merciful and faithful covenant partner who does not miss the mark. We are created for that communion, community, and relationships, and we can foul up and break them. But God restores brokenness. Jesus is still there in the midst of children and speaking to the protection of the vulnerable. That's been the focus of Mark for the past several weeks. We're still there with Jesus, hearing that same concern. Women of the time were particularly vulnerable in terms of relationships. Because of that, there was a wide open opportunity for abuse of the system, which left women and children caught in the wake. Jesus is seeking to call attention to just such people, and how not valuing others who are also created in God's image accordingly is not living in the spirit of God's intent for creation. Bonnie Grimaldi posted this week, "In all our relationship, our work is to open our hearts like a child to God's grace, love, and life in one another, being willing to change and be changed. Our flesh is organic, where we need each other. We have become one flesh with God as we examine and soften our hearts. Nothing can separate us from God's love in Jesus Christ." End quote. Exercising the breadth and scope of love that Jesus did, that's God's will for us. To love and to be loved, to forgive and to be forgiven, to comfort and to be comforted, to serve and be served. It is not good that a person should be alone, it says in Genesis. With each day, our need for one another grows more and more apparent, while our basest human desires and self-centeredness seeks to drive us further from one another. We've been hearing and watching tragedy unfold from the Big Bend of Florida to the mountains and valleys of multiple states. My friend Dave Eck, a pastor in North Carolina, who was my internship supervisor for my Christian education degree, who we've been following and praying for on a very perilous journey posted, "I'm in the mountains of western North Carolina. Worship is going to be fast and loose here with a lot of sharing and crying. I'm actually going back to the cup of cold water from the other week. Having water to drink here this week takes on a whole new meaning than it ever has before." Kind actions, working for the welfare of others, binding up the brokenhearted and protecting the vulnerable, giving that cup of cold water. What good is it, it says in James, "My brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works? Surely that faith cannot save, can it? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill,' and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that?" So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. Creating, upholding, strengthening, preserving relationships to God and to one another is the work of the kingdom of God. God's kingdom, God's way is what Jesus is trying to show us in his words and by his actions. Asking, what more can we do rather than, well, what can I legally get away with? In the end, this is the promise of the gospel, that even our best attempts at thwarting God's grace will be met again and again by God's abounding love. Whether we find ourselves like John McClane, bewildered in a moment of crisis, or simply navigating the daily complexities of relationships, we are called to remember that none of us are meant to walk this journey alone. The current hurricane has been a painful reminder of how quickly life can change, of the fragility of our plans and our comfort. But it also highlights our needs for one another, family, friends, neighbors, and our responsibility to care for those who are the most vulnerable. As we consider Jesus' teachings, it's clear that God's will for us is rooted in love, compassion, and self-giving. When relationships break down, when we fall short, God remains faithful, extending grace and inviting us to do the same for each other. This is what we are called to uphold one another in community, to be agents of healing where there is brokenness, and to protect those who are most in need of care. So as we step back from this reflection, let's ask ourselves, how can I better reflect God's love and grace in my relationships? How can I serve others in their time of need? Whether it's reaching out to a neighbor affected by the storm, offering forgiveness where there's been hurt, or simply being present for someone going through a really rotten time, each of us has the opportunity to bring God's kingdom just a little closer to reality. Let's be mindful that true faith is lived out in our actions. May we be a people who love, forgive, serve, and comfort, just as we've been loved, forgiven, served, and comforted by God. And in all we do, may we remember that we are never, ever alone in this work. God is with us, and we are with each other. Amen.